Phase 0, we have our rapid upstroke. I'm a cardiac myocyte. I have my sister on my right. I have my brother on my left. My sister is depolarized and propagating an action potential. And she depolarizes from right to left as that action potential propagates. It hits my intercalated discs and our commonly shared gap junctions, channels. And my membrane becomes depolarized. I hit threshold. The action potential propagates across me from right to left. It hits the intercalated disc that I share with my brother. We have gap junctions. His membrane becomes depolarized, and he throws an action potential. So when we talk about the threshold potential, my sister is causing me to hit threshold potential. You know by now in ventricular muscle, just like sodium, just like a skeletal muscle and nerve, that means sodium channels become activated. And when you get to a voltage where enough of them are activated, enough of them have open activation gates, you allow enough sodium to come in to where this becomes regenerative, where we increase voltage. That opens more sodium channels, we increase voltage some more, and so on, okay? Note that these sodium channels are very similar to the ones in skeletal muscle, which are very similar to the ones in nerve. They are encoded by different genes. Mutation in one gene will not necessarily, and probably will not, cause disease in all three tissues, okay? Should always note that. T-type calcium channels, we haven't talked about a little bit before, we haven't talked about it up until now. They activate at lower voltage than the L-type calcium channels, I'm going to talk about in a minute, and they activate more rapidly, and they can contribute to this upstroke, but if they do, it ain't by much, because the sodium current is much more rapid, the sodium channels are much denser, and the sodium current really overwhelms them, okay? These are not very common in ventricular muscle. They're a bit more common in atrial muscle, and they're much more common in the SA node and AV node, and we'll talk about that in a minute. You should note the inward rectifier channel. So we talked about the fact that high potassium permeability keeps you at a low resting potential in the last block. And I didn't tell you in skeletal muscle why that resting potential was so low and what was causing it to be so low. I just said there's a lot of potassium permeability there. In fact, what's causing it to be so low are these inward rectifier channels. These are odd channels. The first thing to know about them is they are always open, always, no gates, okay? So at rest, they're open, and they're allowing potassium to flow out. And if you look at the resting potential of about -90 to -80, you can see there's a nice high permeability to potassium, and they will allow potassium to flow out of the cell. And they hold you at that low resting potential. They're the dominant current, okay? So they're like pretty much all potassium channels, all open potassium channels, and that the current goes up the farther away you get from EK, which is -95. We go up, and now look what happens. We start to drop. And that's what's really odd about this channel. It is always open, but for some reason it does not want to conduct potassium ions. It does not want to allow them through at less negative or more positive potentials, okay? So this current gradually goes down as the voltage goes up, and it's only really high at the resting potential or at potentials approaching that, okay? So as phase 0 takes place and we shoot our voltage up to the sky to that +30 mark, these basically shut down. They're still open, but they just don't want to allow potassium to go through. So they're not holding you at rest as much anymore, okay? So they're shutting off. They don't shut off completely, but you can see that current gets really low during phase 0, okay? If we look at phase 1, our sodium channels are now inactivating in a very familiar process to you now, same as skeletal muscle and nerve. And in addition, now we have a new potassium channel to worry about. It is ITO, TO standing for transient outward current. Okay? This is an odd potassium channel too. All the ones that we've talked about so far have one gate, except the inward rectifier, which has none. This one has two, an activation gate and an inactivation gate. So it activates and becomes significant during this phase one, and then inactivation follows that, and it's gradually declining, okay? But it contributes to this initial repolarization, okay? So that's ITO1, all right? ITO2 is a chloride channel current. You don't need to worry about that. L-type calcium channels activate during this phase. They have an activation gate and an inactivation gate, just like sodium channels. Both are slower than sodium channels. So they activate slower, and that activation becomes significant during phase one. And they inactivate slower, and that inactivation is very slow. It's constantly going on, but I would say it does not become significant until phase two, okay? And phase two, right there, is our plateau phase. And you should note that the currents during this phase are all small relative to phase zero and the coming phase three. Okay? And that means it's easy to do things with this plateau phase. You can lengthen it or shorten it very easily by modulating a current, because all the currents are pretty small and they're easy to, I wouldn't say overwhelm, but little changes can have big effects. Okay? And we'll talk more about that Friday and Monday. The sodium-calcium exchanger is active during this phase. You will note that release is going on. You're bringing in calcium to the L-type calcium channel. The calcium's going up, and the sodium-calcium exchanger is beginning to transport that calcium back out of the cell. When you take one calcium out and you bring 3 sodiums in, every time that transporter turns over, you're bringing in an extra charge. And so both the calcium channel current, the L-type calcium channel, that's bringing in positive charge in the form of calcium, and the sodium-calcium exchanger that's bringing in an extra sodium are bringing your voltage up, okay? And they tend to want to make your voltage more positive at this point, okay? They are being fought by the delayed rectifier currents, which are the potassium channels, which are trying to bring your voltage down. So we have a tug-of-war going on involving the sodium-calcium exchanger, the L-type calcium channel, and 3 different types of potassium channels, okay? The IKS, S stands for slow. They activate slowly during this plateau phase. The IKR, R stands for rapid. They activate more rapidly during this plateau phase. And the IKUR, UR stands for ultra-rapid. They activate more rapidly than the rapid ones, okay? And they're more common in atrial cells. I'll talk about that in a minute. The ultra-rapid are more common in atrial cells. These 3 currents, especially IKS, build during the plateau phase and become stronger and stronger, especially IKS. And they're fighting against the calcium channel and the sodium-calcium exchanger. And as you can see, because we're going to enter phase 3 in a second, they are eventually going to win. Again, primarily due to the fact that IKS finally builds to the point where it tips the balance, and it tugs the calcium channel and the sodium-calcium exchanger into the pit. Okay? So phase 3, there we go. L-type calcium channels are inactivating during that plateau phase, and they are deactivating as the voltage goes down. Deactivation means the activation gate is closing. Inactivation means that the inactivation gate is closing. The inactivation gate tends to want to close at high voltage, and we're at high voltage during phase 2. The activation gate opens at higher voltage, but since the voltage is declining during phase 2, it is gradually closing a little bit more and a little bit more, and then as you enter phase 3, it closes even more. So our calcium current is shutting down through both of those mechanisms. And suddenly we're not tugging up toward plus 120 as much anymore. And our delayed rectifiers are built to the point where they're winning the tug of war. And now we pull the calcium channel and the sodium calcium exchanger into the pit, and we get a nice rapid repolarization as our potassium channels fall backwards and go We1. Okay? And our IK1 inward rectifier channel becomes significant again as we get down to those more negative voltages. And of course, it's much more significant down around the resting potential. And so as we enter phase 4, we are at the resting potential where the inward rectifier is really the dominant current. You've got a little bit of calcium influx, a little bit of sodium influx, but really IK1 is the major permeability, and that's why your membrane potential is so negative, okay?